You're tuned into the Writing Community Chat Show, the live streaming YouTube podcast that brings you the stories of authors, screenwriters, and more. Indie or established, this show's for the community, and we invite you to be a part of it. Head to the writingcommunitychatshow.com for more info. The WCCS. Together as one, we get it done.
Hello and welcome to a very special edition of the Writing Community Chat Show. Thank you for joining us. Let's get into it. Hello everybody, and as I've said before, this is a very special edition of the Writing Community Chat Show. Obviously we don't normally do a Tuesday, but this is too special for us to give up our usual Friday slot and wait for that, because it's a fantastic guest tonight and a fantastic book that we get to talk about. So I'm really excited to be joined by said guest, who we'll introduce shortly. But before that, I need to introduce somebody else who is a friend of the show and has been on the show multiple times, so I'm sure you'll recognize her. Ladies and gentlemen, Anna Bloom.
Hi.
Hello. How are you?
Same time. Okay, how are you?
Yeah, I'm good. I mean, it's a little bit different because obviously we've switched up the sort of roles today. Agat's off on his second job. So we've kindly, well, you've kindly, not we, but you've kindly volunteered to step in for him. And
it was kind of you to ask me, and I appreciate it.
Oh, no, we are absolutely thrilled that you decided to step in for him. I'm sure it's going to be great. How's your week been?
It's been pretty good. I drove out to my parents' house on Sunday, so I spent the whole day in the car. But, you know, yesterday I was home, and it's a little weird being home because I haven't been here in 3 years, but it's nice.
Yeah. Have they done that weird thing that parents do and kept your bedroom the same, or did they change it as soon as you moved?
Completely demolished. I don't live in my room anymore. I'm in the guest room now.
Yeah, they straight away, as soon as you moved out, bye, right, let's get that room decorated.
Almost essentially, yeah.
Well, I'm sure you're not alone in that. I'm sure there's lots of people watching now that have had the same experience. If you are watching now, please like and share this around. It does definitely help us with tonight's guest. And obviously, it's a big day in the book world. And yeah, we'll get onto that, I think, because as much as it's nice talking about our bad childhood experiences of our parents getting rid of us as soon as possible, we know what people are here for. So absolutely. I'm going to do the typical Agat thing and then read this out. So ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Writing Community Chat Show. We have a very special guest with us today, an author whose work has captivated readers around the globe. He's a master of fantasy, seamlessly blending the real with the magical in ways that leave us spellbound. You might know him best for the Magician's trilogy, a series that has been hailed as a modern classic and even adapted into successful TV shows. And obviously you can watch that in various different departments. Today, he joins us to discuss his latest novel, The Bright Sword. This new book promises to be a compelling addition to his impressive body of work, delving into the rich tapestry of Arthurian legend with Grossman's unique and gripping storytelling. So, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, please welcome the brilliant Lev Grossman.
Hi, guys.
Hello.
Hi, thank you so much for joining us tonight. It's an absolute privilege to talk to you on release day. Very exciting times. Whereabouts in the world are you coming from, Lev?
I'm currently in New York City. I'm in Brooklyn.
Nice, the Big Apple. So I'm definitely the odd one out here with two Americans and the Brit in the corner. But yeah, I'm sure we're going to have a good conversation. Yeah, so I'm going to play the video because we always forget to do that. But the video that we got first is the road to writing. So we're going to ask you how writing became a part of your life. And we're going to delve into your brain for some writing tips if possible. So here's a quick short video, The Road to Writing.
Chris? Looks like he's frozen. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your road to writing, how you got into it?
Yes, I will tell you about it. Writing was, I come from a writing family. I should confess that up front. My father was a poet, very successful poet, won lots of prizes, wrote lots of books and so on. Oh, Chris, I can see you're in motion again. Somehow you became frozen briefly. So Anna and I just sort of launched into it. But was that the right thing to do?
Absolutely. I was panicking. Yeah, my little British face off because it wasn't working. So yeah, great. Absolutely. Brilliant.
Right. I came from, so my father was a poet. My mom she wrote a novel and a book of stories. She also spent many years teaching writing. So it was always in the mix. And many writers to whom I say this are very envious because they come from families where books are not considered that important. And I accept their envy. And also, I will add that it in some ways it made it easier. In some ways it made it harder for myself to become a writer. I probably decided that writing was my path when I was about 20, having tried several paths, which I hoped would take me away from my parents. It ended up that the thing that I called to me the most was writing, but I was very slow to develop as a writer, and I've never been able to come up with a really great answer for why that is, except to say that when I tried to write novels, I tried to write them the way my parents wrote. My parents were both English professors, both incredibly brilliant people, very much at the high end of the literary spectrum, very much sort of worshippers at the altar of the canon and the great books. And when they wrote, they wanted to write great books. And I felt as though that would be the way I wrote. I would try to write literary fiction. I would be a Zadie Smith or a Jonathan Franzen, and my prose would be incredibly finely crafted, and I wouldn't think too much about plot. I wanted to be Virginia Woolf. I wanted to be Joyce. But as it turns out, I was neither of those things, and it took me a very long time to figure that out. I published 2 novels. The first 2 novels of my career were, I guess you could call them literary novels. I wrote one when I was, I think, 29, and the other one when I was 35. And they took a long time to write, and they were not very successful at all. I wrote them very slowly, and without the kind of improvisatory joy that I now associate with good writing. But at the time, it was just very much one word after another, many revisions. And it wasn't until I was 35 that I hit on the idea for The Magicians. And that idea was hugely energizing and liberating in 2 different ways. One, I very much thought of it as a fantasy novel. This was a genre that didn't have my parents' fingerprints on it. It was, in fact, quite irritating to them that I would undertake a fantasy novel. They didn't consider it all that respectable, which is, it's a little bit embarrassing to imagine a 35-year-old man having a kind of adolescent rebellion moment by writing a fantasy novel. But that's what was going on for me, sort of psychically. And the other thing that was very liberating about that was when I wrote The Magician, and I haven't talked about this very much, really, ever. But when I wrote The Magicians, I was thinking a lot about C.S. Lewis and the Narnia books. And it was helpful to me to think of myself not as writing, but as rewriting. I was taking an existing template or an existing story and re-articulating it according to my sort of vision and sensibility, and even in a kind of sort of combative way, saying, okay, C.S. Lewis, you did well, but you got a few things wrong, and I'm gonna correct you with this book, which does things a little bit differently. That sense of being in tension with another writer was hugely liberating for me and energizing. And that was the first time when I wrote, when I really felt that I had found my own voice, which was when I was talking to another writer when I was writing. And The Magicians was the first book that I wrote that was very successful, and that I was truly proud of. That I felt as though I had expressed something that was deep in here, that I had been trying to get on the page for a long time. And that was really the beginning of my writing, which happened when I started writing The Magicians when I was 35, and had been hacking away at it for 15 years already at that point.
Wow.
I love that. And the fact that you overcame the shadow of the canon and your parents sort of blending into the two. How did you navigate that process with, you've got parents who are very much on the side of, literary greatness and, really appreciate literature. And then you've got that shadow hanging over you as well from things that you've read and that you've been inspired by. And then you're obviously trying to put your own slant on something new. Like, how did you navigate that process, and what advice would you give to somebody in the same or similar position?
I often think to myself, could I possibly have saved myself 15 years or even 1 year by thinking about my writing differently? It was certainly the case that I had always had a very avid fantasy and science fiction reading habit. And it was one that I guess I always felt a little bit embarrassed about when I, at least in front of my parents. So I never really talked about it. It would turn out that the thing that gave me pleasure about reading those books was actually the way forward for me as a writer. And it's funny to think, what did it take for me to admit that to myself? I think that I had to let go of. I don't think I'm alone as a writer in that I want to be I want to be praised for my writing. I want people to think well of me after they've read my writing. And it seemed to me that the kind of writing you got praised for, the kind of writing that was most valued, that people gave awards for, was a certain kind of writing which did not suit me even slightly. I had to let go of any thinking about that side of things to write the way that I wanted to write, which included not just really moving into fantasy or I guess being less conscious of it was more about being less conscious of language and more conscious of storytelling. A lot of the writers who I took as my models were people who took plot apart and just left it lying in pieces on the garage floor. People like Woolf and Joyce, who very much were themselves pushing against earlier writers. They were pushing against the 19th century novel and those elaborate narrative scaffolds set up by people like Dickens. It turned out that storytelling, that plot, was where I actually wanted to live, and how I could say the things that I wanted to say. I think part of the problem was that I had a very academic background. I had studied literature in college and then in graduate school, and the way you analyze literature in those contexts is really it's this sort of close reading process where you're really looking at individual sentences and word choices, and you study it like poetry basically, and you think less about the big picture of the plot, and yet that was, as it turns out, what I needed to be thinking about. That was the engine that drove my writing, and it was very difficult for me to understand that. I think as a useful exercise is to sometimes to go with your lowest instincts, your basest, your basest pleasures. Think about what you're embarrassed to have on a piece of paper and put that down. Sometimes that kind of honesty, which came very slowly to me, is the key, is what unlocks things. Which is, it's a little bit of a gut check moment. Am I really gonna admit that on paper and have that be out of the world? And as it turns out, for me at least, writing was about that. Talking about things that I wasn't necessarily super comfortable with.
Oh no, that's really interesting. People are commenting in the chat, by the way, saying obviously they love The Magicians. Feel free to do that I know there's people watching live now. If you want to put comments in the chat, we will have a section at the end of this show in probably about 25 minutes where you can ask the questions directly, and we'll put them on the screen. But yeah, brilliant. Anna, you made the link before the show, before we were joined by Lev, about the Narnia books. So I think that's a really good segue into maybe asking some questions yourself.
Well, I actually did have a question about that. So I first read the Magician's books when I was in college. So I checked them out of the library. I didn't own them at the time, but when I was doing my road trip home, I re-listened to the audiobook of the first book. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting, or that I noticed now, was how you, in the early in the first book of the Magicians, you do a lot of like this parallel world building where you're talking about the Fillory books and kind of building Fillory as a place, but then you're also building Breakbills as a place. And I was kind of wondering how you managed to do that so smoothly.
I wonder what the answer to that. I can tell it's a good question because I don't immediately know the answer. I think that something that was something that's a very important theme for me, and was even when I was doing my bad early pretentious literary writing, was the difference between fiction and reality. When you are doing storytelling, it lies in fantasy, as you often do in fantasy, where there's a really powerful forward narrative engine. Sometimes I am conscious of the fact, conscious of how different my life is from the story that I'm telling. My life doesn't feel like a story at all. It feels much more like a Joyce novel or a Virginia Woolf novel, where everything's scattered in pieces all the time, and I don't know why I'm doing what I'm doing, or I'm distracted. Something that becomes a theme very early on in The Magicians is the difference between fiction and reality. One very important way in which Quentin, the hero, is different from other famous students at schools for magic, is that when he comes to school to Breakbills, he's a big fantasy fan. He has read a lot of he's read Narnia, well, he's read Fillory, he's read Harry Potter, he's read all those books, which I think would be the case for most of the people who went to an actual school for magic, if there were one. And so when he arrives at Breakbills, he really thinks that he will be the hero of a fantasy novel, that life will be like what the fictions that he's read. And of course it isn't. It diverges quite sharply from those fictions. And so one of the themes of the book becomes about stories and how living life is different from being in a story. And that to some extent was the tension between the Fillory world and the Breakbills world. And I think it's a funny thing I find funny about myself as a writer, which I have very powerful urges to tell stories, to tell heroic, exciting, propulsive stories. And yet then I also, part of me gets interested in the way those stories fall apart and to diverge from reality. I think those two instincts I kind of got stuck on for much of my career, but later I found them really sort of generative. That tension, there was something in that tension that I wanted to write about.
Oh, that's really interesting. Have you ever, when you finished a novel a few years later, one of the things we ask quite often on this show is, do you have a realization moment where you go, I was actually writing about that? And has that happened to you? And if you could you divulge into that a little bit? I know sometimes it's really highly personal, So obviously, don't feel the need if you don't want to.
I'm going to leave out the highly, highly personal part. But almost everything I write, there is that. All 2 years to the day, I'll wake up and think, oh, well, that's what that was. And of course, the story of the magicians is the story about an artist finding their voice. The story about the magicians is actually the story of me writing the magicians in a funny way. When Quentin does magic for the first time, and he's able to release for the first time this power that he's always had inside him, and that he on one level has known was there but didn't really believe that it was there, and finally he sort of takes that leap into space and releases it, and it's incredibly exciting and fulfilling and dynamic. That's Quentin learning to do magic, but it was also for me writing Quentin, that feeling of finally feeling like I'd found my voice, and the joy of writing that I'd always been looking for. So what I realized about the magicians was that it was about writing. It's about creativity for me. Magic is a metaphor for a lot of stuff, which is one of the things that's great about it. But one of those things for me was about artistic creation. And the first book, The Magicians, it's very much about somebody learning to create, someone who's been stuck their whole life and finally getting free.
Love that. And there's questions coming into the chat, which we'll ask in the third section of the show. But if you're watching now and you have got questions about the magicians, or the series in its entirety, or the Bright Sword, please put them in the chat. I am saving them. I am starring them. So we will ask them in the third section. Honor, have you got any more questions before we move on to the what's the story, the second section? I'm guessing not.
Anna, did you catch that? I'm not sure that is everything going through?
Yeah, everything's going through on my side. I'm not seeing the second story, what's the story video though?
No, because I asked if you got any questions before I play it.
Oh, sorry. No, you did cut out for a second. Yeah, I guess my question would be so obviously Quentin is the main character, and you did talk about how you see parts of yourself in him, but do you see parts of yourself in any of your other characters from the Magician's books or from your other books?
Oh, very much. Very much. Something I notice about the Magician's books is that the first book is all from Quentin's point of view, and the second book is divided between Julia and Quentin, and the third book is refracted through quite a few different characters. And I think it was very obvious to me what I had in common with Quentin, for good or ill. But I actually, in a funny way, was making this journey and realizing that there were parts of me in all those characters, and they represented parts of me that I couldn't at first give voice to. Janet was a character that I love to write, and she's very unfiltered, and she's quite mean and funny, and that's an aspect of myself that I carefully edit out of my daily encounters with people. But Jan doesn't, and it was very liberating to kind of to let go of that editing and just write her the way that I thought, but never dared to talk. But lots of those characters. Josh was a character who was comic relief, really, in the first book, and it then occurred to me that he was really tired of being comic relief and wanted to be taken seriously, and that became sort of his journey in the second and third books. Another thing which is another thing really that it's an experience that I and probably most people have had. So there's always a seed of something that I'm feeling goes into all those characters. Except for maybe Elliot. Elliot's just somebody that I wish that I were, but I don't know that I actually really am him. But I that's my aspirational self.
Brilliant. Yeah, before we go into the next section and we find out what's the story, just going to ask one more question. If you could give somebody who just started out with writing and they had aspirations of writing a novel, just one piece of advice, what would you say to them?
There's lots. I had to figure out a way to somehow take the frame around. This is not going to come out very clearly, but I needed to sort of take the frame from around my writing. I was thinking of it very self-consciously as a work of art, something that would be published one day and bound between covers, and rated by critics and things like that. I needed to get it into a much more personal and informed place. And something that I used for that was, and I'm far from the only writer who does this, but I imagined myself, rather than writing a book, I'm writing an email to a friend of mine. I'm telling them about something that happened, and immediately it engages a whole different set of instincts, verbally and emotionally, which sometimes are the instincts that you really need to bring to the writing process. But they're hard to summon when you are writing on a blank page for the ghosts of posterity. Instead, but if somebody you really like and feel comfortable with, it's amazing what comes up when you're just telling it to another person, rather than writing into a book. So that's a way that I have for getting unstuck. I get stuck all the time. I have many ways of getting unstuck, but I find that that's a good one.
Yeah, that's a brilliant bit of advice. We've done over 200 shows and we've never had that as advice, but I think it's brilliant. Perfect. Right, I'm going to brave this video, and if I don't come back on immediately after, I'm going to let you guys carry on without me, but I am going to play it. So this section is what's the story, and normally directly after the video, if you could give us an elevator pitch for The Bright Sword, that would be great. I'm back and it worked. So can you give us the elevator pitch for The Bright Sword?
Sure. It's going to be really bad because I'm bad at elevator pitching. But I mentioned earlier about that feeling of how I found it energizing to think of myself not as writing, but as rewriting. And in The Bright Sword, I'm rewriting the story of King Arthur. I'm retelling it. And one of the big obvious ways in which I am transforming it by retelling it is kind of widening the lens to include the story of what happens after Arthur's death, which on the face of it is a slightly perverse thing to do, since how can you have a King Arthur novel when King Arthur isn't there anymore? But it becomes much more about these few surviving characters. It's really almost a post-apocalypse novel. These few characters who've survived the fall of Camelot, and who are in this now darkened, broken world that's lost its way. And they're trying to put it back together and rebuild Camelot and find a new king and put them on the throne. And in a way, roll back the clock and bring back the age of Arthur, which they have lost. And they're sort of a funny ragbag of people who aren't generally the heroes of King Arthur's stories. And they bring a very new perspective and new kinds of voices to that story. And one of the things they do is that they have to figure out, they need to go back over the story of Arthur and come to a new understanding of who he was and why he fell, so that it doesn't happen again. And so in that way, we look back, we flash back to the days when Arthur was alive, and we get most of Arthur's story really with the sword and the stone and everything else, but seen through a different lens. That was a long elevator pitch. We went up many floors or down them, but I'll work on that. You're catching by the way, on the day of publication of The Bright Sword, which is a day that I have thought about and fantasized about for about 10 years. So if my nerves seem jangled, that is probably the reason why. They're jangled in a good way, but they are a bit jangled.
That's
I think you're doing a brilliant job.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a great elevator pitch. Any questions, Anna, on The Bright Sword?
So listening to your elevator pitch, I do have a question. So you said The Magicians was kind of you versus C.S. Lewis. So is this book kind of you in response to any specific Arthurian books, or just an addition to kind of everything that's out there about King Arthur?
I mentioned that this book took me 10 years to write. And I think part of the problem, one of the things that I had to figure out was who I was talking to. Because, for me, the looming figures in the Arthurian tradition above everybody else really are T.H. White from the Once and Future King, and before him, and he was rewriting Thomas Malory, who wrote the Morte d'Arthur. It was a less straightforward thing engaging with an entire tradition, which is what I feel like I ended up trying to do, rather than with a specific writer and a specific work of art. Early on, I felt as though the toolkit that I had for The Magicians would be adequate for this task, and it was very much not. And I think one of the things that I tried to do in The Magicians was sort of bring a lot of humor and maybe a slightly darker sensibility to the sunny uplands of Narnia. This was not that. It was different. Arthur, I began to realize he demanded, he was not going to be treated the way I treated Fillory. He demanded more respect than that. And I realized that something about Arthur is that he needed to be good. In fact, he needed to be great. He needed to be the greatest king who ever lived. And he needed to be a good man as well, because when you take those things away from Arthur, he sort of stops being Arthur. So writing about somebody who is a little bit larger than life and is truly good it turned out quite a new challenge for me.
Mm. Was it something that you felt the weight of expectation? Like you said, 10 years, I can imagine as each of those years passes, the feeling of when you reading drafts and things like that, it just piling on. So how did you cope with that, and how did you navigate it?
I have two answers to that. One is it was difficult, and it doesn't take 10 years to write a novel. Anybody who takes 10 years to write a novel has gotten in the weeds and gotten stuck, and that's why it took so long. And I got in the weeds, many different weeds, at many different times, and it was difficult because every year that went by, I think, okay, I've now spent 6 years on this project. What could I possibly write that would be worth 6 years of my life? And suddenly the stakes were that much higher, and they were even higher after 7 years and after 8. The expectations that I began to place on myself were very high, and sort of at times sort of paralyzingly high, because I just sit there and think, what could I write that could possibly be worth all this? All this time that I'm sinking into it. That was not a very productive way to think, but I did find myself thinking that way. And I will add, because often writers talk about expectations and how challenging they are. Nothing is as challenging as not knowing if you're a writer or not. I very clearly remember the period of my life when I couldn't get published or could barely get published, and nobody cared what I wrote. That was much harder than having expectations. I would have been grateful for those expectations. So it was difficult, but I don't want to lay it on too thick. Because writing before you've been published, I found that harder than anything. And in retrospect, I don't know how I got through it.
So take us to today then. What's it like, obviously, being you today, and the Bright Sword is out and people can get their hands on it? Like, how are you feeling today? What talk us through that if you can.
It is this. There's some irony in the fact that I, who am an extremely thin-skinned and guarded person, chose to take up a profession in which I expose myself very personally and publicly to other people's gazes and sort of judgment. So I find it quite challenging, really, to shift gears out of being solitary to being out in the world. I will be going later to a bookstore where I'll talk to a bunch of people. I find shifting gears in that way quite difficult. And even after 10 years, I find myself thinking, I'm not ready. But what was I doing all those 10 years? Surely I must be ready by now. And of course, I mean, reviews start pouring in. Just tsunamis of social media sort of start coming at you, and it's amazing because it's tough when nobody's paying attention. And again, I don't want to lay it on too thick. I feel I'm very blessed to have people paying attention when I write something, but it can be unsettling for somebody who is introverted most of the time.
I've got a slight question. I've never asked this question before, but it's just occurred to me when I've been listening to you. If you could say one thing to readers that wasn't on the jacket, what would you want to say?
That's a good question. I mean, I think my greatest fear about this book, honestly, is that people will, when the knock on The Magicians, I feel like it's been people think it's snarky and sort of sarcastic. And I guess it is a little bit snarky and sarcastic, although I like to think it's other things as well. I feel as though my fear about The Bright Sword is that it'll be about taking Arthur down a peg. Whereas, in fact, it's there's a lot of very unironic emotions in this book. It's very much about a longing to be good. It's very much about mourning things that are lost. I hope that people won't mistake my intentions towards King Arthur, because he's a character I deeply love. And as I said before, one of the first things I figured out was that I needed to respect him. Not too much. I couldn't simply represent what I needed to alter in some way what the tradition that I was kind of adding to. But I think the book is quite funny, but it contains a lot of deep feeling, which it's not ironized or sarcastic, really, in the least.
Brilliant. Well, I think we've got a lot of questions. We've got some questions in the chat, and I've got a hatful actually of questions from somebody. So I'm going to play the next video, and we'll get onto the staple questions that we have from the writing community. If you've got any questions, if you're watching right now, please send them into the chat, and we'll ask them. But we have got quite a lot, so we might have to have some quick fire answers, because I know you've got about 23 minutes before you need to go on and get ready for that book signing. So I'll go and play this next video. Okay, so I'm going to skip some of the staple questions and go straight into the community questions with a mixture of community questions and honors questions. So the first one that I started in the chat was, you said you studied lit. Did you ever feel that a lot of time studying lit means placing way too much emphasis on what the writer's intent is or was? And thank you for that question.
The answer to that is a yes. One thing you realize when you publish books, which I think is something that every academic should do, is write a novel and or a poem and see what it's like to have other people read it. You realize that much of the meaning of a book comes from the person who is reading it. It really is. It's very much a duet. It's not like a movie where you are telling a story and there's music playing and there's actors giving line readings. And everything is very much, its sort of mood and meaning is very set. In books, all you're giving people is this little stream of words. And it is up to them to bring to life an entire world and cast of characters from within themselves, which means that what reading people read is very individual. And it often has less to do with me than I would have thought.
Brilliant. Right. The next person we've got in the chat is Carolyn Jones, and she says she sent me a pile of questions, and she has. So I'm going to ask some of those questions now. I'm just going to look in a separate document. So it says, the first one, and there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So maybe quick fire responses. How do you feel about people identifying the magicians as a Harry Potter for grown-ups?
I feel fine. I think I've already outed myself as a rewriter, it's perfectly fair. I don't really mind it.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind it too. I mean, the little section of the money that she's earned from the books would be good for everyone. So yeah, that comparison could go on every front cover if that was in my shoes. The next one says, one of the things I struggle with as a writer is knowing when something is finished. You worked on The Bright Sword for obviously 10 years. How did you know that it was time to publish it?
I thought it was done. So at least 4 or 5 times I thought it was done, and I turned it in. And my editor's job was to tell me that it wasn't done. I actually don't know. I don't know how you tell something is done. I think it's one of the tricky things about being a writer. I can remember having actual tantrums about whether something was done, and then realizing the next day, in hideous embarrassment, that the other person was right. I would say it's one of the mysteries and one of the challenges of writing is knowing when to stop.
Yeah, definitely. Do you find that obviously with the success that you've had, have you got the same editor and kept the same editor, or because I suppose my question is, do you think there'd be a reluctance from the editor to edit your work knowing that it's been so successful?
It's something I've talked about with my editor. Fortunately, my editor is somebody who's not even slightly afraid of me, despite my attempts to intimidate them. And that's a very good quality in an editor, because she knows her own mind, and she's not going to let herself be overruled by me. It's good to have somebody like that around.
Yeah, no, definitely. Next question from Carolyn is, do you consult the I can't say that. I know she's going to stump me.
Yeah,
there we go.
Famous collection of Old Welsh tales, many of which have Arthur in it. I did consult the Mabinogion, and in fact, if you read The Bright Sword, anybody familiar with the Mabinogion will spot some traces of it, and one, in fact, entire chapter, which is a little Mabinogion tribute chapter. No one has spotted it yet, so you might be the first.
Very interesting, very insightful question. We've got a few more, but Anna, I'm going to pass it over to you if you've got any questions of your own.
So I have a question regarding The Bright Sword. So if you were to ask somebody who's about to read it to pay attention to one character in specific, or one character's journey, or some kind of insight that the character has, which character would it be, and what would you want them to take away from that character, if it's not like revealing too much of the plot?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the obvious character to pay attention to is Colin, who I guess is not nominally the hero of the main narrative strand. But of course, it's Arthur who most clearly articulates what the book's about. And we see him only in flashback, and we only spend a short time in his head. We sort of circle around him and see him from many angles, and then towards the end, we actually get inside him. And he's the one. He's so smart. He's the one who puts everything together. Of course, he puts it together too late to save himself or anybody else. But he's the one, and what he thinks basically is about. In a way, it's about stories. The story of King Arthur always ends with Arthur's death. But of course, there are many people around him who have to live on after the worst has happened. In post-apocalypse. And how do you do that? How do you live on after the sun has gone out? That's the big challenge that Bright Sword explores.
That is a beautiful, beautiful line. How do you live on after the sun has burnt out? Yeah, that's brilliant. Another question here. What did you think of the Netflix version of The Magicians, and would you be open to a screen version of The Bright Sword?
The Netflix, really, it's Netflix carries it, but it was made by Syfy, which is an American sort of cable channel, or it was. I actually don't know if it exists anymore. I thought it was fantastic. It's quite different from The Magicians in many ways, which it took me a little while to figure out. They had their own vision for what the story was about, which in retrospect, it would have been weird if it was identical with mine. And the important thing was that they had a vision. I found the show very funny and sexy, and interestingly different from The Magicians. I think of them as two very, very separate things. And I've the rights to The Bright Sword have been optioned. They're with Lionsgate, and I'd love to see it on screen. I am I'm very into storytelling, and mostly that's about doing it on the page. But I love to tell stories on screen, and I think it would be amazing to do this one. One thing that TV lets you do is to go. You have many more hours than you do with the book, and much more space. You can go into bits you couldn't go into with the book. Do that.
Nice. I'm going to ask you a staple question that we have on the show, and that is, if you could take one character from fiction and make that character your own, which you've kind of already done a little bit, but which character would it be and why? So maybe one, obviously, that you've not delved into yet.
I should answer with the character who is leaping into my mind, and that's Sherlock Holmes. I love Sherlock Holmes. And it's tough because people have done such good Sherlock Holmeses. I question whether I have anything new to bring to him. But this idea of somebody who is an overpowering genius and can solve every crime around him, but can't figure himself out or solve his own problems, is kind of endlessly fascinating and affecting to me.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant answer. I think it would work really well. Another question that we have on the show is, if you could change the ending to any fictional story, what would you change the ending to and why?
I'd love to change the ending of Harry Potter. Something that I think that Rowling chose not to deal with is how traumatized Harry would have been, and the toll that what he'd been through would have taken on his later life. If we're going to flash forward at the end of Deathly Hallows, which apparently we are, I'd love to see Harry after he's processed that and gone through his drinking phase, and his promiscuous phase, and his aimless wandering phase, self-destructive phase. I'd love to see him on the other side of that. I don't know that we truly got that.
Yeah, I would love to see that as well. The Ginny Weasley phase when she's having to clean up after alcoholic Harry. Yeah, that would be an interesting book. Yeah, that would be a good one to read. Another question that we ask on the show is, if you had to send a piece of fiction into space, knowing that an alien race may eventually read it, what would you be sending?
Again, I'm going to go with the first answer that comes to me, and that's probably Arcadia, the play by Tom Stoppard. I'm not particularly a theater person. I almost never go to the theater, but that happens to be one of the works of literature that I feel sort of most in love with. And I think it does a good job laying out a lot of the predicaments of humanity circa this time.
Yeah, definitely. It's a good answer. I feel like we've already touched on this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway, just in case the answer's slightly different. But Quentin, we all love him. But is he based on someone significant?
I think this question is a trap, and I'm just going to walk into it. Quentin's based on me. he's based on me when I was 17. If you think that a real person could not be that emotionally oblivious, I'm here to tell you you're wrong. I was not that good at that, I'll tell you that. But I was not as tall as Quentin, but I had a lot in common with him, and I drew on myself most of all when writing that character.
Brilliant. Anna, have you got any more questions before I answer?
Yeah, I do have a question actually piggybacking off of this one. Since Quentin is based on you, and obviously the show is very different from the books, how did you feel about what happened to Quentin at the end of season 4?
I have complicated feelings about it. Overall, I mean, the way that they handled the everybody's response to Quentin's death was pretty amazing. Actually, I thought it was really, really wonderful, and so affecting. Narratively, would I have framed Quentin's death in that way? I probably would have done it differently. Narratively and sort of visually, and if you were to ask me in what way differently, it would be hard for me to put my finger on it. There's ambiguity around his death. You know, was it suicide? Was it a great sacrifice that he made to save other people? What exactly was it? I think I probably try to draw those lines a little more clearly, but I don't mean to find fault with the show.
That wasn't my point. I just kind of wanted to.
No, I know. But it was a powerful moment, which I can't take credit for because it was all them, and it was amazing.
The next question that I'm going to ask, again, I feel like you've touched on it a little bit, but in the Magician's verse, you have Ember and Umber. How far were these linked to Aslan?
They were going to be more linked to Aslan. I think when I started writing the book, I saw it more as satire and less of its own thing, which I find is actually often the case. People start out feeling they're just going to goof on something that they love, but they have something to say about it, and then it turns out into its own thing. And so I think I originally thought of them. I at first thought they were going to be a satire of Aslan, but they became something different. They became a lot about my parents. I've overshared, but there it is. And about the problem of what kind of God would allow evil and suffering to be in the world that they are running. It became a little bit about that too.
Yeah, I love that. I'm going to ask one more question, I think, because obviously I'm trying to factor in the time. And we do, again, this is a staple question, but it's a bit morbid. You're on your deathbed. You're looking back at your writing career. What would you be happy with? What is success to you?
This is so about 6 months ago, I had a sort of cardiac problem. I was running, I got chest pains. Like an idiot, I went home and took a Tylenol, went to bed. But then 2 days later, I realized I really need to go to the ER, and I did. And they said, you've had a huge heart attack, and we're not sure what's going to happen. Wow. It turned out that I hadn't had a heart attack. I had something that looks like a heart attack, but it's much less serious. But I spent about 2 hours thinking about how thinking that maybe I was on my deathbed. I wasn't completely sure. And when I think about things that I'm proud of, it's really the ends of my books. It's the end of The Magician's Land, and it's the end of The Bright Sword. Like many writers, it's that thing, that metaphor of driving across country, and you can see 20 feet ahead in the headlights, and but you also know that you're heading for the coast. I always knew the coast that I was heading for with those books. And I felt really proud of where they ended up. I think people expected the endings to be a little bit downery or cynical, whereas in fact they're moments of hope and very tender feeling. I've always felt proud of that, And I think that's probably where my mind went. Of course, I wasn't done revising The Bright Sword when I had my pretend heart attack, and so I was really irritated that I wasn't going to be able to do those last run over the page proofs. That was mostly what I thought about.
Brilliant. I'm glad you didn't have a heart attack, and obviously that you're definitely on the mend.
Very glad.
Yeah. Obviously, I'm conscious of time, so we are going to end it a little bit shorter than usual. Just one thing before we go. Where can people pick up a copy of The Bright Sword, and where can they find more information about you, should they want to stalk you on social media?
I'm on Twitter and the other one, Threads quite a lot. You can always go to my website, which is levgrossman.com, and The Bright Sword can be found wherever fine books are sold.
Brilliant. Yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting to you today. Obviously, if you're watching now, yeah, it's been fantastic. Thank you. I'm going to end the show very shortly, but if you're watching now, please obviously share this around. It'd be absolutely fantastic. And obviously pick up a copy of The Bright Sword. And yeah, get in touch if you like the show, or if you like The Bright Sword and you agree with Lev in terms of the ending, or maybe you have a bit of rage and you're like, oh, I can't believe you ended it this way. Put it in the comments. Get in touch with him on social media. I'm sure he'd appreciate that. But for now, we'll see you guys on Friday. And thank you very much, Lev, for joining us tonight. I wish you every success, obviously, with The Bright Sword and the rest of your promotional journey.
Good luck with the book. I hear you'll be in Boston tomorrow. That's my city.
Oh, is that right?
I'm not there right now, but yeah, that's where
it's my hometown. I grew up outside Boston, so it's always good to go back. Thank you.
Get yourself over there, Anna. Thank you. Right. This is where we wave and I play the video, and goodbye. So thank you. See you on Friday. Bye.